The patriarchs faced challenges in ensuring their household remained free from foreign gods and idols, especially in the time when surrounding cultures were steeped in idolatry. For instance, Jacob had to address this issue when he learned that his family possessed foreign gods, likely brought by his wife Rachel when he left her father's house. In Genesis chapter 35, 2 through 4, Jacob instructs his household to rid themselves of their foreign gods and purify themselves before they journey to Bethel to worship Yahweh. This involved gathering all the idols and burying them under an oak tree, symbolizing a decisive break from idolatrous practice. The patriots emphasized the exclusive worship of Yahweh, setting a foundation for the spiritual purity and monotheism that would define the Israelite identity. I'm Dr. Ray, and welcome to this week's Hosea International Speaks. I'm going to relate to you a story which is actually funny, but when you get to thinking about it, one can take a few minutes to think about it and see that they too might be doing this and following the same pattern as Jacob's family. We have to start with Abraham, and then we will return to the story of Jacob and exactly what he was doing when he commanded his household to rid themselves of households of idols and foreign worshipers. Dealing with the idols and gods during the days of the patriarch was a task that was set up by Abraham. This is told in a story about Abraham before leaving the Ur of Chaldees, which is, I was telling you, it's quite funny. It was he who was in his father's shop, Terah, remember his father Terah, who was an idol worshiper and a seller of idols. This is the story how the Bereshit Rabbah tells it. And let me explain what that means. Bereshit Rabbah is a religious text from Judaism's classical period, probably between 300 and 500 AD, and some with later additions. It is a Midrash comprising a collection of ancient rabbinical, homiletical, and interpretations of the book of Genesis. And we'll just leave it at that because I could go on forever. Now, back to Abraham's in his father's shop. One time Terah, went away to a place, and he installed Abraham as salesman in his stead. A person came in seeking to buy an idol. Abraham, asked the buyer, "How old are you?" In which the person answered, 50, 60 years old. And then Abraham said to him, "Woe to this man who is 60 years old and seeks to prostrate himself before something that is only 1 day old. He would be ashamed." And the man left. One time, a woman came carrying a dish of fine flour in her hand. She said to Abraham, "Here, offer it before them." To which Abraham arose, took a club in his hand, and shattered all the idols and placed the club in the hand of the largest among them. When his father came home, he said to him, "Who did this?" And he said to him, "I will not lie to you. A certain woman came carrying a dish of fine flour in her hand. And she said to me, 'Here, offer it before them.' I offered it before them. Then this one," the big one, "I shall eat first." Then the big one said, "I shall eat first." And then the next one said, "I shall eat first." Then the big idol who was standing among them got up, took the club, and shattered them. He, Terah, his father, said to him, "What are you mocking me? Are they all sentient at all?" He said to him, that is, Abraham said to his father, "Do you hear not what your mouth is saying?" In the cleaning process, the thought came over him, how can a God so fragile as this, made by the hands of man, break so easily? And it is probably at this story that is believed that Yahweh called Abraham out of the Ur of the Chaldees. Now, this brings us into today's session and exactly what it is that Jacob, who has now become the living patriarch and to whom Yahweh is relying on to teach his children, especially when it comes to idols and carvings that are worshiped. I'm going to read you a portion of transcript from Tom Bradford's notes on Genesis chapter 35, which is excellent and something that we may have overlooked when it comes to dealing with idols, especially in the days of Abraham, Isaac, and when Jacob was brought up in. Chapter 35 is rich in information, but largely is hidden from our view due to the Greek and English translation. So we're going to connect some dots that have obscured over the centuries as we look through this chapter. In verse 1, God orders Jacob, Israel, pack up and move to Bethel, the place where so many years ago that Jacob had stopped on his journey out of Canaan into seeing his uncle Laban or Mesopotamia. In turn, Jacob orders his households, and then upon returning, he would then where he saw the angels ascending and descending between heaven and earth. In turn now, Jacob orders his household to get rid of all the idols and idolatrous symbols. The sacking of Shechem by Israel's sons, Levi and Simeon, and taking there many of Shechem's people had introduced also newcomers into Israel's clan. And these newcomers, in particular, worshipped other gods. Even more, Jacob's sons would have stolen the gods' idols of Shechem, because this, by the way of thinking, would have stolen power away from Shechem. It was normal for any invader or conqueror to steal the enemy's idols because it is very tangible, and it, in a way, weakens the enemy in its addition to humiliating them. The phrase of God's instruction to Jacob points out the mindset of that time. And to me, it demonstrates the supreme patience of Yahweh in developing and maturing his infant nation of Israel. Notice that the proper translation of verse 1 has God telling Jacob to build an altar at Bethel. Notice this phrase, to the God, not to their God, who appeared to you. He didn't say build an altar to me. This is the kind of an odd way for Yahweh to refer to himself as, again, the God who appeared to you, because it has a kind of a built-in implication that there were other gods. But he is the particular God that appeared to Jacob at Bethel. According to the traditional ways of that era, it was thought that gods were many and they were territorial. In addition to having specific job descriptions, and gods from different territories would fight against gods from other territories. Are you getting the story? Or perhaps better, one God was more powerful than another. So in Mesopotamia, for example, the god of the rain was only the god of the rain for Mesopotamia. He was responsible for rain somewhere. He wasn't responsible for rain somewhere else, because there were other gods of rain in other places. Everybody believed this way. Everybody. And we really don't find Yahweh hammering away, making a point that he is the only God that exists. Rather, he characterizes himself as Jacob's God. We have no record of Jehovah or Yahweh telling Jacob while up in Mesopotamia to build an altar to him up there. And I doubt that it happened, because Yahweh was a God that was associated with the land. I want you to notice that he was associated with the land of Canaan, not Mesopotamia. But now that Jacob was back in Canaan, the God or Yahweh of the promised land, Jehovah, tells Jacob, to build him an altar. Make perfect sense to Jacob and probably to most of his tribe, even the newcomers, although they had no idea what reality actually was. I tell you this because as we read through the Torah, understanding that just who Yahweh is and how he operated and where his sphere of influence began and ended was just as fuzzy to the minds of the Israelites as was the concept of what happened to somebody after they died. They didn't have any concept. Certainly after the Exodus, you can read, when we read that, Yahweh defined himself much more extensively. But people just don't forget centuries of tradition. Rather, Israel tended to understand Yahweh within the context of all their long-held beliefs and traditions. He was just added to the mix. Can we understand why, when giving the 10 commandments to Moses, that the very first commandment was, "You shall have no other gods before you"? Can you imagine bringing all the gods of Egypt out? Yahweh was their God, Jacob's God, Israel's God. But what happened? Then their God matched wits and powers with a God from another people of another land. Who knew? This was constantly on their mind. So here we are, 200 years after Abraham got the call, and still Jacob doesn't quite get who God, Yahweh, is. And his wives and the others who made themselves part of the family certainly didn't get it either. So as part of our ongoing education process by Yahweh, we see Jacob saying, okay, we're now under the sphere of influence by personal, my God. And we're going to build an altar to him. So I don't want your gods upsetting my God. That's funny. And besides, your gods are useless here in a territory that is outside their primary area of influence anyway. So give them to me, and I'm going to bury them under a tree. Why bury them? Why not smash them or burn them? Because this was a more repudiation of their gods than an absolute belief that those gods didn't exist. This part in verse 4 about getting rid of the earrings has nothing to do with God condemning earrings now. Just listen to this. These rings were worn in honor of foreign gods. They were amulets, so they too had to be removed from their mindset and buried. As part of this process, they were also instructed to change clothes and purify themselves. Changing their clothes simply means washing their clothes or changing into clean ones. The changing of clothes was a rather usual part of the purification procedures. These idols and symbols were buried under what some Bibles called an oak tree. Others call it a pistachio tree, and some of them other trees. But actually, it was a terebinth tree. That is of the pistachio family, but it's not an oak tree. After purifying themselves and burying the foreign gods, symbols, the clan moves to Luz, and there Israel builds the altar. Don't let the name Luz or Luz confuse you. Luz was simply the name the Canaanites people had called their place. Hebrews called it Bethel. We'll see a lot of this double meaning in the Bible, often using both the Canaanite and the Hebrew names. Suddenly we get this interesting little aside in the scripture. And you recall when Eliezer, the servant of Job, a servant of Abraham, brought Rebekah back from Mesopotamia as a wife for Isaac, that her nurse or nanny accompanied her back to Canaan. Well, now the much beloved Deborah dies, and there is much grieving in the camp. You need to listen to this part. But why does the Torah even mention Deborah, a seemingly minor role player in the grand scope of things? After all, the deaths of matriarch Rebecca and Leah, or Rachel and Leah, are prominent female figures in all creation and the formation of Israel. Are not these recorded? No, they're not. While the explanation is not universally accepted among Jewish scholars, it is generally thought that Deborah represents, notice this, the link between Israel and Mesopotamia, a link that God is in the process of removing or dissolving. Up to this point, for Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, Mesopotamia was, as far as they were concerned, more their homeland than Canaan. But Canaan was the land Yahweh had set apart and promised to Abraham and his descendants. We're going to leave it there for a while, and we're going to pick that up, part 2 of this, next week of chapter 35, because it's really interesting, the last half of this lesson. Well, if you enjoyed this week, go ahead and hit the like button. And if you have not yet subscribed, now is a good time to subscribe. If you still wish to give, go ahead and scan the QR codes. There's 2 of them that you can go ahead and scan. And if you wish to write me, you can do it at 2 locations, at Hosea International at yahoo.com or Hosea INT Speaks at gmail.com. I'm Dr. Ray, and I'll see you next week on Hosea International Speaks.